microphone. I have a strong voice, but not that strong. It's 2016, and what have we heard over the last few days? There is still a long way to go to improve women's employment opportunities and to reduce these salary differentials. Yesterday, we heard from the CEO of Coca-Cola, Muhtar Kent, a self-declared feminist who wants to empower women. Business obviously has a big role, but so do governments and policymakers. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce two leaders and policymakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce Canada's first Minister for the Status of Women, Patty Hajdu. Patty, please come and join us. Thank you. Please do take... Patty Hajdu is the first federal minister fully dedicated to gender issues. The minister also has a very interesting background. She was a social worker, working with many marginalized communities suffering from substance abuse, poverty, and homelessness in Canada. I'd also like to introduce France's former Minister for the Economy, Industry, and Digital Affairs, and as many of you may know, the presidential hopeful for the En Marche movement, a movement that is a force for change, Emmanuel Macron. So please do take a seat. Right. Later, I will also be joined by Arancha González, who's the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. So I'm going to ask a few questions, then Arancha is going to come and give her perspective, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Patty, let me give you the mic. Patty, in 2015, a UN human rights report raised concerns about, and I quote, persisting inequalities between women and men in Canada, including the high level of the gender wage gap and its disproportionate effect on low-income women, visible minority women, and Indigenous women. Do you share that concern?
Well, absolutely, and thank you very much for the question. We're starting with the easy ones, I see. But we know that we have a long ways to go. And from the perspective of my Prime Minister and me, and actually all of our team, you can't actually make improvement if you're not looking at the facts. We want to be an evidence-based government, data-driven, and so we take this very seriously, and in fact, it's one of the driving reasons that the Prime Minister was so adamant that we put gender equality at the core of our platform, and then later on our plan for real change. And so it's been my privilege to serve as the very first full Minister of Status of Women. What that means is that in the past, we have had ministers that represent gender equality, but it's been a part-time position attached to other very weighty portfolios like health and labor. And you can imagine what happens to gender equality when you're also trying to make sure that the wellness of a country is taken care of, for example. And so the Prime Minister was very intentional in ensuring that we would have someone that was doing this in a full-time capacity. And this is one of the things that how we're taking steps to start to address those terrible facts that you've mentioned.
Yes, you're evidence-based, and the data doesn't look as good as you might think from Canada because it's the 6th highest gender wage gap out of 34 OECD countries. So you rank at number 28, I understand, in the gender wage gap between male and female full-time workers. Why is it so high?
Well, some of it we know, and some of it we don't know, and it's the same actually where we see this gender wage gap. Some of it is policy. We were very excited, for example, to support the recommendations of a special committee on pay equity for federally regulated workplaces, and we'll be introducing legislation to address that in 2018. That's something that will address part of the gender wage gap. But in fact, about 15% is what they call unexplained. And a lot goes into that unexplained. long-held stereotypes about women, the fact that we see a very poor representation of women in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We are a resource based economy, and so many of the mining efforts, forestry efforts, we could see as low as 3 to 5% women participating in the high-paying fields. So that we have a lot of work to do in a number of realms, and certainly it's a challenge, but certainly a worthwhile one.
Yes, this is a new acronym I learnt, STEM, and I will ask you about that in a moment. I just want to get to the specifics. You're going to introduce some legislation in 2018. Can you give us a sneak preview? What is that legislation to reduce these salary differentials and to make sure that Canada doesn't rank quite so high?
Well, the federally regulated spaces, we have hundreds of thousands of jobs in federally regulated corporations, and so this is a space that we can actually have some control over as a federal government. It's much more difficult to introduce legislation that affects private sector employers, but we can actually lead by example. And that's why we felt it was so important to support the recommendations of this special committee that was struck to look at pay equity. Pay equity, I would probably put everybody to sleep if I started talking about the mechanics of pay equity. I've actually gone through it in the organization that I ran previously to this job. Essentially, though, what it is looking at is, are women in similar categories of jobs, not necessarily the same job, but do mechanics and yard workers and cleaners all make relatively the same given the scope of their duties? And if not, the legislation will proactively compel employers to go through the process of making those job categories equitable. That's probably the most simple way that I can describe pay equity.
Yeah, no, it's complicated, what you put in the calculation. Mr. Macron, you're most probably aware, on the 7th of November, women in France were asked to down tools, go off the job. And it was actually at 4:34 p.m. and 7 seconds. Now, why was that? That was because that was the theoretical moment when women start working for free. Can you imagine? I would never work for free until the end of the year, before the average pay gap between men and women. That's due to it. Now, Mr. Macron, what are you going to do to try and reduce those salary differentials? Because I understand at the rate of progress that France is making so far, it will be at the end of the 21st century, 2186, when women are earning the same as men.
Thanks very much for inviting me, because it provides such an experience. I think that's something similar with a woman in France being part of an executive board or something like that. Being one or two male in such an assembly.
So, good, isn't it? It's good. It's positive discrimination.
Yeah, but so it means something. So thanks for this experience.
Exactly. So, if you were to become president, sir, what would you do about this disgraceful gender pay gap?
But because I think that this situation you describe is directly linked with what I just mentioned. The fact that women are not properly represented in executive boards, in our National Assembly, and are not fully part of those who take decisions and who have taken decisions on a lot of these issues. That's the first explanation. When you look at this salary gap between men and women in France, and when you try to find the proper explanations, it's something comparable with what you described for your country. First, it's part-time jobs. Because when you look at job participation for male and women, when you look at the situation, 66%, something like that, of women do participate to our labor market. But 80% of our women in France have part-time jobs they didn't choose. They want to work for a full-time job, which de facto creates, basically, a gap in terms of salary. Second, access to responsibility and opportunity. So that's one of the key explanations of this gap. Third, careers. And the best answers are a series of answers. First, stop with discrimination. And today, you still have a lot of discrimination when you hire people, and we accept that. You have laws, and we passed a series of laws, because in France, we are obsessed by laws and the ability to create new legislation, I have to say, but we don't apply them.
So what can you do to apply laws on discrimination?
You have to strengthen the answer when you have discrimination, through testing, especially, a series of processes. And what is true for female is true for minorities as well, because we exactly have the same issue. We exactly have the same laws. We are supposed to forbid this kind of practices, but we don't control properly this kind of behavior. So, testing and strong answer. Second, in a lot of cities in this country, we don't have the proper answer for women when they have children. First, because you have this social representation and it's not properly shared between men and women. And the burden of the children, I have to say, is not fairly shared between men and women, de facto. And second, when you don't have precisely all the infrastructures allowing you to go to work, you are forced basically to stop your careers during years and years. That's an inequality, and that's an investment to be made, not just for women and an actual equality, but for children as well.
If we just take that point, what practically then can you do to ensure that having children working part-time is not seen as hampering women's progression? What would you like to see? More paternity leave, following the Swedish model that men also have 3 months as well as women?
We passed 2 years ago in France such a law, sharing paternity leaves and precisely sharing the responsibilities. That's a cultural issue. In France, it's changing. We are definitely different from Germany, for instance, and a lot of other European countries regarding this issue. But we have to move forward. And I think what you need is first to have the legal framework. Now, that's the case. We passed a very useful legislation. Second, you need role models. And I think that's very important regarding this issue. You need role models. You need first to promote some men sharing this responsibility, taking their leaves when they have children, and having great careers. And you need leaders in corporates, in the political field, having such a career and taking the responsibilities. And on the other side, you need to promote, and that's the case in this room, and I recognize a lot of very well-known faces, but you need women role models, and that's a critical issue. When you don't have a role model, you don't precisely break a sort of cultural blockage, and you don't manage to progress in your society. And that's where allowing female to access to responsibilities in the business field, in the political field, is absolutely critical. Because today you have 17% of executive top jobs for women. You have 3 to 40 top executive jobs in the CAC 40 in France to women. And you have something between 15 and 20% of our representatives at the National Assembly as women.
And what would you like to see if you became president? What percentages and what figures in these top jobs and perhaps in a potential cabinet?
But, 50%, because when you look at the situation, I have to confess something. Women are not a minority. It's 50%.
So that means that...
And there is, there is a big confusion in our country. A lot of people, a lot of policymakers consider that gender policy is a minority policy. I'm sorry, that's not almost the case. And if they are even realistic for themselves, they should consider the fact that it could become minority in a few decades. So, definitely...
50-50 cabinet.
50-50 cabinet and 50-50 at the National Assembly. But it's not just by law that you can change such a situation. It's through your own practices.
Of course.
But that's absolutely critical. I founded 8 months ago a new political movement, En Marche, that you mentioned. At the very beginning, I had a lot of men, because they are overrepresented in the political field. And after a few months, I had this issue saying, okay, guys, I have a lot of young, white men, which is not, first, exactly the faith of our country, and second, I'm not sure that's the best way to embody this renewal. So we opened the door progressively. But that's an effort. I mean, a lot of women consider that political commitment and taking their part, taking a role, a commitment in a movement, is not for her and for them.
Not in this room, sir. Not
no,
in this room.
I agree with you. No, but that's the case in the society. We try to go to these women saying, okay, you should commit. You should be part of the club. Saying, I'm sorry, I have a job, I have my family, I hate politics. I don't want to be part of this game. Why? Because this game was made by men for men, with a lack of civility in a certain way, with specific rules absolutely impossible for women, and especially women with a successful career. But you know what? It's exactly the same now for men. Men in my generation don't go to politics for exactly the same reason. So my deep conviction is that the more you manage to convince women to be engaged, to go to politics, the more you will change roles, and the more you will attract talents, but both coming from both sides. So we appointed a series of representatives in each local constituencies. We implemented the 50-50 rules. Now, I designed, and here in this department, our representative is a woman, but I have 50% women in my representatives. In the other political parties, it's between 10 to 20%. After that, when they go to the election for the National Assembly, they propose, when they don't want to pay and to be punished, they propose 50% of women. But in hopeless constituencies, and when you look at the situation at the end of the day, you have just 15% of representatives as women.
So they'll be in constituencies where they actually have a chance of winning, will they? This is your aim.
Exactly, but the day you have 50% of your top executives in the movement as women, you have exactly the same chances, the same opportunities. And that's why, formally in France, you have a sort of equality. We passed a lot of laws. We have a good job participation for women. Women are extremely well represented at the university, more than men. But you have today this discrimination, and you have a big loss of opportunity for women in our society, but for our society as a whole, which is absolutely critical.
I'm sure everybody in this room would agree that. And I just thought that in the spirit of networking, I met a wonderful woman last night who is French-Canadian. Her name is Rebecca Anselm, and she's the fondatrice, the founder of Les Glorieuses. She's an economist, and I'm sure that she could be a very useful advisor for the salary differential.
Excellent.
She's very bright, very young, and has some very concrete ideas. If I may move back to Patty in the spirit of equality, you've been, as you say, tweeting at this forum about the importance of empowering women through innovation, technology, and creative solutions. I mean, these are these STEM careers. What would you like actually to see at a policy level to perhaps encourage women to go into these high-profile careers rather than perhaps the teaching or the nursing, which are great careers but underpaid?
It sounds like an easy answer, but it really isn't, because I think there's many components to that. And we have a similar phenomenon where we're seeing more women than ever enter the STEM sector streams in education. And then sometimes even gaining employment in that field and then leaving those fields. And they're leaving those fields because, as they report back to us, oftentimes the fields have not adjusted to having women in those fields. So again, opportunities such as mining or even engineering or things that have remote locations in Canada. We're a vast country. You have to travel many, many hours sometimes to get to these places. Don't have access to childcare. Once a woman has a child, the long, 10 days in, 10 days out doesn't work for her. So those are some of the challenges. I think there are a number of things that we can do through government, but there are also, and I think we have a responsibility to lead by example, but what we're talking about is a cultural change. We're talking about shifting culture where we see the benefit of having women in non-traditional sectors and throughout government and throughout leadership opportunities in our corporations. And I think that we can set the stage as a government with a certain degree of policy. We can certainly promote inclusion throughout the types of financial supports that we give, for example, to universities. We can set policies ourselves in terms of procurement practices. We can, work with corporations to both sort of educate corporations. We could do things like comply and explain in terms of board diversity. But really, culture change is going to take all of us. And I think that that's what we're trying to do in Canada, is inspire a culture of inclusivity. As you know, the Prime Minister has said over and over and over, we are stronger because of our diversity, not in spite of it. It's a core value for Canadians, and it does include gender. And we believe that it has to be intentional with gender, and that's why it's separated out, because women are 50% of our population. But that intentionality is so important. Because in fact, if you don't set targets and you don't actually, plan policy, but also think about how you're going to inspire your country to have different conversations and create a sense of competitiveness to a certain degree within your own country about being the first, being a progressive company, being an innovating company, then in fact, it's all talk, it's all air, and that's the last thing we want. So it's a combination of factors of which government plays one role.
Do you think there's a role for positive discrimination? Because in France, there is a 40% quota, as I understand it, on women in boards, which will come into place in 2017. In Canada, I read that there's about a 19% percentage of women in boards. Mm-hmm. So do you believe that there should be some quota, or that board terms should be fixed so that there's more women who come through?
We're not at the quota place yet, and I'll tell you why. One piece of me says, well, maybe we should set a target of quotas. But again, I think that it doesn't necessarily compel the kind of change that we want. And some countries that have quotas say it's working fairly well. Other countries are saying, we thought that this was the magic bullet, but it really isn't. Because the problem with legislation, and I think you've summarized it admirably, is that if legislation isn't enforced, so what? I mean, are there penalties? Is it an incentive program? It's the deeper question is, what happens when you don't enforce the legislation? How do you actually change a culture to want those changes rather than punish people into those changes? And so we're not opposed to examining quotas at some point. We've actually just expanded the comply and explain provision. As you know, it's a bill that's in front of our legislation right now. I have every confidence it will pass. But to us, quotas is not necessarily the silver bullet. It may be something that we attempt if, in fact, we don't see progress in the next few years with the initiatives that we're undertaking. But at this point, we do believe it's deeper than a quota.
Mr. Macron, quotas the silver bullet, or would you like to see more quotas if you were to be president? Is this something that you think can be legislated and actually enforced?
I think it's not silver bullet, but it allows to change behaviors. And you mentioned in this law passed a few years ago called Copé-Zimmermann for presence of women in executive boards. And it allows in our country to come from 10% to 36%. So, it provides some effect. I think now our key issue is not to have women in boards, but as, top executive members. It's something different because you have to reorganize the company, you have to promote women progressively at different levels. But I do think that we will probably need some quota for top executive members. And I do agree with this idea. But I do agree with what you mentioned, the fact that it's not silver bullet. For me, the best way to succeed in this way is to say you need innovation and inclusivity. For me, the two legs of modernity today are innovation and inclusivity. When you are in a country or in a company and you don't innovate, you can go very well on a day-to-day basis, but you are already dead because of the fact that a competitor will suddenly arrive, will innovate, disrupt your market, and will kill your business model. When you don't have inclusivity in terms of gender policy, minority policy, but in your neighborhood, you are dead as well on mid to long run. Because you cannot succeed by excluding part of your society, by don't providing precisely a due role to everybody. So I do believe today that our companies and our policymakers will integrate into the model, I have to say, or their own decision, these two legs.
You said some quotas. Can I push you on that? What are you looking for in specifics?
I think to have quotas with sort of mid-term objectives, exactly like for Koppe-Zimmermann, is a very good solution. We did it. It's not the unique solution because we failed in terms of representativity in the political field. But I think if you provide 5 to 10 years to move forward and to have X% of top executives as women, I do believe it will be a trigger for a reorganization, a reprocessing, and the best way to promote women at the different levels. So my point is to say, I think we need quota for women in top executive jobs. Second, it's not sufficient. You need role model and you need to promote innovation and inclusivity. And third, you need to increase your aggressivity, I would say, in terms of discrimination. Because a lot of today young women are discriminated in our countries, exactly like a lot of minorities. If you don't answer very aggressively and very rapidly, that's a nightmare for her and for them. But that's the best way to, in a certain way, nurture frustration and divisions in the society. Promoting women in top jobs and top executive jobs will change on the mid to long run this situation because their sensitivity to this issue will be different, for sure. But you need a short-term approach as well.
And will we be seeing some specific commitments like that in a manifesto shortly?
Definitely.
When?
If I'm here today, it's definitely because I consider that this question is not just that a box that you have to tick in a program. I don't believe in 100 to 200 measures in a program. I will have a few commitments, but inclusivity.
Could you not give us a sneak preview in front of these top women from around the world? Something concrete and specific. That's what we want, isn't it?
By end of February.
End of February.
On this topic, you will have a strong commitment.
Okay. February the 28th. Put it in your agenda. And of course, I have to ask you, because I asked Mr. Kent, and we know that Justin is a self-declared feminist. You are a self-declared feminist, aren't you, Mr. Macron?
I am, but for me, my first objective is to be a feminist recognized by women, which is much more important.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce Arancha González, Executive Director of the International Trade Center in Geneva. Arancha, you most probably will have heard of her. She had leading positions at the World Trade Organization and also in the European Commission. Arancha, please come and join us. First of all, can I just ask you for your reflections on what you've heard, and is there anything specific that you would like to ask?
So, what I heard, let me sum this up. But without being provocative, of course. First, this is not about women. This is about societies. This is not about gender. This is about diversity. This is not just about passing laws. It's about making sure they are implemented. This is not just about representation in politics. It's about the economy. You remember that president who said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, for women, it's also about the economy. And my final one, I haven't heard it, but I want to bring this to the conversation. It's not just about Canada or France, it's also about the bottom of the pyramid. We have 1 billion women excluded from the economy today. 1 billion. If we were to include them in the economy, it's like adding China and the US to the global economy. And guess what? The bulk of these women are in poor countries. The bulk of these women are in the informal sector. The bulk of these women are in the rural sector. The bulk of these women don't have a voice. So I want us to make sure that as we plan for the changes that we will introduce in Canada, for the changes that we will introduce in France, and frankly, there is a bit of changes to be introduced, we also have to think about, and this is the question I would like to ask them also, what is it that they think they can do to give the voice to these millions of women that today don't have a voice? We have to be also their voice. Now, what is it that I would like to see? I would like to see the next forum to be devoted to this amazing Canadian woman for gender issues and the amazing hopeful president for France to come back here to tell us what is it that they have done in this year that went by. How much did they achieve of what they said they would achieve?
I agree. Perhaps we should actually ask the question about the 1 billion women who are disempowered and who don't have access to international trade markets. What can we do for those in the so-called OECD countries' developed world?
No, I do agree with what Arancha said. And beyond our countries, this issue is there because it's unfair and inefficient for everybody. We intervene as Europeans in these countries. And I think this issue, empowerment of women and opportunities for women, has to be part of our criteria when we help this country, when we provide subsidies. And today, in a very tiny part of our commitments, we take into consideration this criteria.
Increasing overseas aid budgets, even in these cash-strapped
Increasing,
times.
but as well, changing the way to intervene in this country. And I think the great opportunity you have in a lot of this country is that entrepreneurship and state of mind is progressively changing as well, and very rapidly changing. Regarding this 1 billion mentioned by Arancha a few seconds ago, you have a lot of countries where traditionally our countries just dealt with government, with great leaders, and an insider's market, I would say. And everything we discuss about is about outsiders' interests. Sometimes insiders in our society are just white men. Sometimes insiders are just a series of black men. The big question mark is how to give a voice, a representation, and different interests for these outsiders. The way we start to take into consideration the outsiders' issue in our interventions in this country, in our subsidies, in our policies, you change everything. You reduce corruption, you increase control, you promote and accelerate entrepreneurship, and you accelerate the inclusivity of this entrepreneurship.
Patty.
Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. And certainly we can talk about other countries, but Canada, as you mentioned in your early opening statements, Claire, has a history with women, especially Indigenous women, in extremely dire poverty forever, for a very long time, who experience extremely high rates of violence. During the previous government's term, there was a growing call for an inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. It was not something the previous government was interested in doing, and in fact, it was my first official job on behalf of the Government of Canada. And I toured through the country, and I listened to women who had stories of exclusion and poverty and marginalization and family disruption and the most horrific violence that led to the loss of their daughters and their nieces and their grandmothers and their mothers. And it was a profound experience. Even though I had worked with that population before, the volume was what surprised me. And so we were very proud to launch the inquiry into murdered and missing women this summer. And furthermore, we're just about to launch a federal strategy to address gender-based violence. And why I'm talking about that is because at the foundation of women's economic success, it has to be safety. And in Canada, women, like many other countries, are facing astronomical rates of violence. And again, we believe that we can do more. We believe that we can lead a strategy that will inspire our provincial colleagues and our municipal and territorial colleagues to contribute to women's safety in a way that we haven't done before. So that's one thing in terms of our own policy. But I agree with Francois about Francois, right? I agree about Francois. I'm sorry.
Didn't he just abdicate? He's just left, hasn't he? I think, yes. He's history.
I could add a joke here, but I'm going to behave myself now. That inclusive agendas have to be at the forefront of our governments. People have to see that there's a place for them in the policies that we design. They have to feel like their government knows that they exist and that there is hope and that they will be able to find a job and that they will be able to find a home and that someone cares about the fact of, that they're living on the margins and that they have a voice at the cabinet table. And I was so pleased to have our conversation earlier about the fact that there's been a lot of press, a lot of spilt ink, as they say, about the gender balance in our cabinet. But let me tell you about the other kind of diversity in that cabinet. We have people from low socioeconomic backgrounds like myself. I'm the first in my family to receive a formal post-secondary education, all the way up to people who have multiple, histories, come from a much higher socioeconomic status, have many, many degrees, very well-accomplished business owners. We have women, we have men, we have people who have a physical disability. We have people who are very young, 31, all the way up to people who are in their 70s. We have experienced politicians. We have people like me who are the first time in this arena. And that diversity is extremely valuable as well, because when a decision comes to cabinet, not only are we talking about it through the lens of, the lens of our gender, but also we see it through the lens of people who have extraordinary disability. We see it through the lens of people who have different faith representations and different sexual orientation. And these conversations, I cannot tell you how rich they are and how I believe they make better policy. And, by the way, a better way to connect with Canadians. Because, in fact, when you have someone who is quadriplegic and has been so since 18 years old and knows the barriers that people have to face in order to make it through their day every day, that is a perspective I will never have. And I would say that for too long, we have had primarily white men making decisions. And one of the ideas that I've heard predominantly discussed at this conference is the notion of invisible bias. People are not making these decisions necessarily to be cruel. They're doing them because it's the way they see the world. And if you're not challenged to see the world through somebody else's eyes, you cannot make inclusive decisions. And so that's why it's so important, the diversity that you're talking about, from a policy place. Because, are we there yet? Absolutely not. But do we have a better chance to make inclusive policy? I say affirmatively yes.
Thank you. Arancha, the International Trade Center, you're part of a She Trade initiative, which you set up in 2015. You're seeking to connect 1 million women entrepreneurs to markets by 2020. Can you briefly tell us what are the barriers and what do you hope to achieve?
So She Trades, and I want each one of you to go to your mobile telephones, shetrades.com. Please tweet about this. We want to connect 1 million women entrepreneurs to markets by 2020. Frankly, I've told you about the 1 billion. 1 million is a drop in the oceans. But if we do it next year, then we can scale this up. If we do it together, we will do more than 1 million. We'll get closer to the 1 billion. What are the problems we face? Women entrepreneurs don't participate in international trade because their businesses are too small. Why is it that they are too small? Because the women want it? No. 4 problems. 1, women have no access to credit. It's much more difficult for them to access credit than to men. Why? Because very often they don't have the right to own assets. Imagine, 95% of countries in this world still have a law that discriminates women against men. And the bulk of these discriminations have to do with your ability to own assets or to sign contracts. Let's make sure we do away with these laws. This is something we can all do. 2, it's about not just legal restrictions, but also discriminations in the practice. The law may be the same, the practice is not. You go through customs, law is the same. But if you're a woman, you're more likely to be asked for a little, behind, under the counter, below the counter. This is proven, by the way. This is not me saying it. There are reports on that. 3, women lack access to networks. It's important that we build these networks because this is what we don't have, that men have for the reasons that we just heard. 4th, and equally important, women do a lot of unpaid work. And this unpaid work pushes women to be in the informal sector or on many jobs, because this is the only way to make compatible their family responsibilities with their economies. So if we find a way to fix these obstacles, and if we make sure that we put more women in the economy, if we put more women in international trade, then we will be empowering them and making them be greater contributors to our economy. Again, I want to go back to this economy that we like to talk about, but we don't do enough. It's not just a question of rights, it's a question of economic self-interest for any country in this world. We have extremely low growth rates all over, and we need to push up these growth rates, and we need to do this in a manner that is inclusive so that the benefits percolate the lower levels.
Arancha, you set the target, 2020, 1 million women entrepreneurs. We're now in 2016. Where are you at?
We are at around 800,000. These are commitments that organizations, that individuals, that businesses have taken to connect these women. We are at 800,000 in less than 1 year. I want us to get to the 1 million fast, please, because the challenge is 1 billion. I know it's many zeros, but from 1 million to 1 billion, we've still got a way to go.
And that will mean that you'll actually have to partner perhaps with women's rights organizations, because many of these issues are actually women's rights issues, aren't they, in these countries?
Again, partly is about rights, partly is about implementation of policies, partly is about financing, partly is about networks. This is why it's got to be a global movement. This is not just about governments, it's about governments, it's about the private sector. The private sector markets those that buy. Instead of buying blindly, put on your gender lenses and understand from whom you're buying. Because maybe you don't realize, but you can do an amazing good, but just simply asking the question, who is my supplier? States, since we are talking to governments, states buy public procurement 15 trillion goods a year, and only this 1% is procured from women vendors. So this is where governments, private sector, NGOs, activists, networks need to come together. And my final point, we need to have mechanisms to check results and impact.
Definitely.
You know, more than laws, we need accountability mechanisms. What you don't know, you don't care. But once you know, you cannot but care. It's not my quote. It's Sheryl Sandberg. I always quote it because I think it's very urgent that we get gender disaggregated data all across a spectrum.
Yeah, certainly. Evidence-based comes back to what Patty was saying at the beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been told we have 10 minutes for questions. So I would like, there's a lady in front of me. Please ask, tell me your name and who you would like to ask a question to.
Hello, I come from a Chinese media called Global Caixin, and my colleague and I have some questions for Mr. Macron.
Okay, we can perhaps have one question for Mr. Macron, and then in the spirit of gender equality, we'll have to share it around. But yes, please, do go ahead.
I'm a minority today.
So one or two questions?
One or two, yeah, there we are. They push. I know. I've been a journalist too.
Okay, so I have the right to two questions?
Two questions.
Okay, just two. The first one, Mr. François Fillon, who won the right-wing primary election, has declared that he personally was...
Let's just see what the question is, but get to it, because this is a women's forum, so let's not get too broad.
Of course. He declared that personally he was against the right of abortion. And do you consider that Mr. Fillon treats women's rights if he is elected president?
Yes, first question.
Second one, Mr. François Hollande gave up to run for election yesterday, and he called for an upsurge of all progressists, and you declare yourself as the representative of all progressists, and your presence today is another proof. And do you consider yourself as the best capable personality to lead this group of progressists?
Okay.
Thank you.
Fine. I'm sure you can answer. You get the impression.
As for your first question, it was a big debate in the campaign of the primary election, indeed for the rightist party. I will not comment on personal behaviors and so on. I do hope and I do think that François Fillon doesn't envisage to modify any law regarding anti-abortion for sure, and he confirmed that. So I will not comment personal remarks and so on. I'm deeply involved, and all the progressists are deeply involved, indeed, to preserve this right, and I think there is now a strong consensus in our society, obviously, to protect this right and to improve conditions in different neighborhoods in France for women to precisely have the right to access to anti-abortion practices. Because, once again, it's not just a question of legislation or law, that's a question of assessment, of reality, and actual conditions for a lot of women in our country. As for your second question, I took my decision largely before President Hollande's decision and announcement yesterday. Indeed, he made an appeal and a call for all the progressists gathering. I noticed, like you, this word, progressists, because that's the one I used. I do hope that a lot of people will listen to this call, because progressists are those who believe in innovation, in gender equality, in environment and digital, in equity and equal opportunities in our society, and in Europe. And when you look at these values, there is a deep shift today on the left and on the right side. Because a lot of people in the rightist party don't share this view, but a lot of them do share this view and are not properly represented by their candidate today, and it will be exactly the same case tomorrow on the left. So my ambition is to refund our political organization, but to propose a new project for the country precisely around this value and a clear progressive vision, because I do believe we need to gather people sharing this value and this vision for the country.
Thank you. I've taken a question from over there. Is there a question from over here? Yes, the lady here in the scarf, please. And who is your question for?
It's for both of you. Marie-Laure Hallman, I'm with ExxonMobil. We talked a lot over the last couple of days about unconscious bias, and you said as well we should stop discrimination. Can you give us just your practical advice on what we should do when we get back on Monday to our work? What practical advice do you have for us? Thank you.
Patty.
Well, thank you very much. And I've been working and listening to corporations over the last couple of months about exactly what they're doing. And the very first thing is it has to come from the top. So ask for a meeting with your CEO. Do it. Use your courage and your connections to encourage your leadership team to make this a priority. Because in fact, if it's not a priority of your leaders, it will be very, very difficult to disseminate through your organization. But there's always a practical thing with starting with yourself. I'm a firm believer that all change starts with us. And so there are a number of tools that you can use online. There are a number of great resources that will help you understand that we all hold bias. We all have preconceptions. We all carry certain beliefs about others, and it is unconscious. And in order for us to encourage others to reveal themselves to themselves, really, we need to know ourselves. And so I would say start with you, but also encourage your leadership to make this a priority, and tell them they'll make more money if they do it.
Mr. Macron.
No, I'd agree. Ask those you never meet and you never encompass in your processes what they think about it. Enlarge the spectrum of those you involve. Give the floor to the outsiders in your own organization. That's the first way to have a clear view on your own unconscious biases. And do the same with your leaders right after. And indeed, that's a big source of innovation. That's a big source of better understanding of the others and a big source of inclusivity.
Thank you. Over here, there's a lady, yes, with the glasses on, please. This is the use of swivel chairs. They suddenly become very useful.
Hi, Isabel Toledano from UBS Investment Bank. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Minister, you've been a true inspiration over the last 2 days, so thank you. And therefore, my question to you, Mr. Macron, is do you think we should create a role such as the one of the minister, should you be elected?
A minister for the status of women, like Patty, designated for gender issues.
That's already the case. We had in our past this kind of job. I do believe for the same issue, not a minister to pass new laws, but a minister reporting to the Prime Minister to check and precisely to be sure that behaviors are changing, practices are changing. So yes.
Thank you. Yes. It's all videoed. It's all on record. Okay. Is there anything?
I was not informed about that.
Dear me. Okay. Is there anything from this area? There's a lady here. Yes, please. What's your name and who would you like to answer your question?
I'm Sadia. I'm a student at Sciences Po Paris. And my question is for everyone, kind of, but mostly for Mr. Macron, because I'm a student here. But it's taking from examples from Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal. So my education at Sciences Po is great. I'm a hardcore Sciences Piste. I love it. But I've noticed that in France in general, there's a general lack of gender studies, even in high school, as compared to my colleagues who are studying in Vancouver or Montreal. Are you going to do any change in gender studies? Because I think education is what will change the mindsets of the people that we live with and the people that we study with? Is that on the plan at all?
I will leave the floor to answer on Patty as well. I don't have a clear view about that, to be fair with you. I'm not a big fan. When I traveled, obviously I followed some lessons on gender studies, especially in the Anglo-Saxon universities where it's properly organized. I think it should be part of, of the other aspect of the education. It should change indeed the program and be part of history, philosophy, and as well. I'm not totally sure I'm a big fan of gender studies or gender studies as a specific organization within University of Sciences Po. I have to say, first because that's not in our culture in France, which doesn't mean that we don't respect and we don't have a big place and this willingness to change things and conscious biases and change the organization. And when you look basically at women participation and so on, you see that there is not an issue regarding that in France. But I'm not a big fan of creating gender studies, to be fair. I don't want to commit myself to something I'm not clear on and I'm not totally convinced on. So I will not bullshit you. I'm not a big fan of that.
That's the quote, isn't it? Patty, what about gender studies? Is that something that you see in Canada is useful, or should it be integrated into all university curriculums?
We actually don't dictate the way that education unfolds through. It's really a provincial decision. But I am a fan of education of all sorts. And so for me, I think it's about options. And I think if people have an opportunity to study gender and they want to study gender, there should be gender courses available. I think from my perspective is if you were to have that and eliminate it, there would be a gap. I can speak more from the perspective of true education, if you will, because we in our country are revisiting our relationship. We're trying, I suppose, to restart a relationship with Indigenous people. And this is a conversation that's happening not around gender, but around Indigenous history of Canada. And that has not been talked about or taught in any comprehensive way. And the challenge with that is we have generations of Canadians growing up not understanding the true history of their country, not understanding why it is that Indigenous people face such high rates of poverty and such high rates of all kinds of socioeconomic challenges. And we've been very thoughtful at the federal level, but I know at the provincial and the municipal level there's been the beginnings of very thoughtful work about how do we actually start to talk about the true history of our country. Yeah. And we're on a rejuvenation process around education to make sure that Canadians understand the true history. Listen, when I was going through school, and I took Canadian history, I heard all about the wars, and mainly men, by the way. Laura Secord, but nobody else. And we did not hear about Indigenous people, except in the context of ancient historical, practices. But we didn't hear about contact. We didn't hear about the periods of time that have caused such great damage to Indigenous people. And so when I think about your question around gender studies, I think it's important. Because I think that having options to study the challenges that we face as a society, the milestones that have contributed to where we are, that's the value of an educated society. We have to know where we've been in order to chart a course forward. And we have to, I think, make sure that options are available for people who are interested and passionate about learning more about what it's like in terms of gender relationships in your country.
Arancha.
So if the question is whether I would have a box on gender in university or in high school so that we tick the box, answer no. What I want is two things. I want our learning, the learning of our history, the learning of our literature, the learning of mathematics and physics and chemistry to embed in the content of the studies the presence of women in all these areas. But more importantly, I want our educational system to help us educate individuals in values. And I want the value to be diversity and solidarity and respect for human rights and open societies, because these are the values that we need to transmit, that citizens need to have in order to make sure that the laws that we pass are actually implemented, in order to make sure that we don't have unconscious bias, because we've been educated in putting on our gender lenses. So I want more education in values, in principles. And this is an area where, frankly, there is a way to go.
Arancha, thank you for that call to action. And that indeed brings us to the end of this recorded session. Mr. Macron, thank you very much for making the time. Patty Hajdu, thank you very much. And Arancha González, thank you very much.
We come back next year to report.
I would like very much to introduce, she needs no introduction, Jacqueline Franjot, the CEO of the Women's Forum.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Arancha. You were great. And I hope to see you in the next forum. And for women, of course, and exchange with men. Thank you, Emmanuel. If you can please join your seats.